Welcome to Making Contact, an international radio program seeking to create connections between people, vital ideas, and important information. This week on Making Contact.
What the transnational corporations want to do, and in fact the domestic ones as well, is undermine democratic functioning, but ensure that there'll be a powerful state to subsidize them.
On this special edition of Making Contact, author and professor of linguistics at MIT, Noam Chomsky, discusses democracy and the common good with our national producer, David Barsamian.
In early January, you had the opportunity to address the Congressional Progressive Caucus, a group of about 50 progressives in Congress. How did that go for you, and what did you talk about?
Well, to put it a little more exactly, the 50 progressive members of Congress were part of the organizing group for the conference, but I don't know how many of them were. I saw a few, but I don't know whether others were there. There was just a big audience, and it was part of a long meeting in which many of them came in, and I don't know how many, and there was a good, lively atmosphere and good bit of vitality. I thought it was pretty encouraging. From what I could see, the event looked, which wasn't all of it, it looked like a pretty encouraging step. In fact, I thought it was kind of striking that it didn't get media coverage, since it's pretty rare that anything like that happens. I don't recall anything similar.
And the topic of what you talked about was entitled The Common Good. Can you talk about that?
Well, that title was given to me, actually, and I started by saying that's not I'm a little puzzled by the title, but since it was given to me and I'm a nice, obedient type, I just talked about it. And I started from the beginning with Aristotle's Politics, which is kind of the foundation for most subsequent political theory, and pointed out that he assumed that it's mostly, a lot of it's about democracy, and he took it for granted that a democracy would be fully participatory and that it would aim for the common good, but that in order to achieve that, the democracy would have to be what we today call a welfare state, which would ensure lasting prosperity for the poor, relative equality, and moderate but sufficient property for everyone. If there are extremes of poor and rich, or if you don't if you don't make sure that there's lasting prosperity for everyone, then you can't talk seriously about a democracy. And he went on to, and then I mentioned that idea runs right through the good bit of the tradition, up until through the Enlightenment and classical liberalism, including the major figures like de Tocqueville and Adam Smith and others. It's just kind of assumed, Jefferson and so on. There's another point that Aristotle made which took a little twist in our own constitutional system. He pointed out that if you had a perfect democracy, this is kind of theoretical, his discussion in part, if you have a perfect democracy, and you haven't granted lasting prosperity to the poor, and you do have big differences of wealth, very rich and a small number of very rich and a large number of very poor. In that case, in a perfect democracy, the poor will use their democratic rights to take away the property of the rich. And he regards that as unjust, and if it is unjust, there are two possible solutions. One is to eliminate poverty, the other is to eliminate democracy. Well, James Madison, who was no fool, noticed the same problem, and whereas Aristotle's solution, a couple of thousand years earlier, was to eliminate poverty, Madison's was to eliminate democracy. So he discusses quite explicitly in the Constitutional Convention that we have this problem that if we do have democracy, then the majority of the poor will use their power to do things like what we would nowadays call agrarian reform, and that can't be tolerated. That would be unjust, since the primary goal of government is, in his words, to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And in order to, and he also, no fool again, pointed out that over time, as time goes on, this problem is going to get worse, because there's going to be a growing percentage, a part of the population that will suffer from the serious inequities of the society, and will secretly long for a more equal, equitable distribution of life's blessings. And if they have the vote, they may do something about it, which is unacceptable, not for Aristotle's reasons, but because it would threaten the wealth and power of the opulent minority. So he therefore designed a system which is pretty stable, in which you would make sure that democracy didn't function, that, as he put it, power would be in the hands of the more capable set of men, those who hold the wealth of the nation, and the rest would be factionalized and marginalized in various ways. So that's one solution. The problem is real. I mean, whether you decide it's a problem or not is another question, but the fact is correct. If you have a democratic system with large inequities of wealth, and the great majority is impoverished and doesn't have access to that, and secretly sighs for a more equitable share of life's blessings, in Madison's words, then they'll probably do something about it. And they have mechanisms in a democracy. That part is correct, which means they will threaten the rights of the wealthy to control the property. And remember, property rights are not like other rights, contrary to what Madison and a lot of modern political theory says. If I have the right of free speech, it doesn't interfere with your right of free speech. But if I have property, that interferes with your right to have that property. You don't have it, I have it. So the right to property is very different from the right to freedom of speech. This is often put very misleadingly about rights of property. Property has no right. But if we just make sense out of this, maybe there is a right to property. One could debate that, but it's very different from other rights. And it is surely the case that if the majority lacks the property and is suffering and secretly desires a more equitable distribution, they have mechanisms to do something about it. That's right. And as I say, there were two solutions. The classical one was to eliminate poverty. The one on which our own society was founded was to eliminate democracy. That's sort of worth understanding. And it takes various forms over the years, but the problem never ends. And we're facing it right now. I mean, if a democratic society were allowed to function, it's extremely unlikely that the things that are now called inevitable results of the market would ever be tolerated, because they simply concentrate wealth and power and harm the vast majority, and there's certainly no reason for people to tolerate that.
As we sit here, the World Economic Forum is being held in Davos, Switzerland. It's a 6-day meeting of political and corporate elites with people like Bill Gates of Microsoft and John Welch of GE and Benjamin Netanyahu and Newt Gingrich and on and on. The companies represented at this forum do something like $4.5 trillion worth of business a year. Against this backdrop of globalization and the growth and power of transnational corporations, what actions should be taken to reverse this process?
Well, it depends what time span and range you're thinking of. I mean, you read constantly that this is somehow inevitable, no way to stop it, like Thomas Friedman in yesterday's Times or whatever it was. People who just mocks people who say you can do something about this. Well, that's certainly not true. For one thing, we should be aware of the scale of globalization. In many ways, what's called globalization is bringing about a situation which is not unlike what it was when, say, at the early part of this century. If you look at gross measures, like, say, trade and investment flow, and so on, it's relative to the economy. It's getting back to more or less where it was